So last week we left Jesus and a lawyer having a theological discussion that had implications for the law. Or it might have been a legal discussion with implications for theology, depending upon your perspective. And the discussion began like this, with the lawyer asking Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" In other words, the lawyer believed that he could work his way to heaven. He believed that there was something that he could do to earn God's favor in order to merit eternal life. This is known as works righteousness. And the Bible teaches precisely the opposite, that we are not saved by works, we are not saved by anything that we might do, but we are saved by grace, lest any of us boast. Now, being saved by grace is free, but it doesn't mean that it is not expensive. It doesn't mean that it is not costly. And there is a cost to being saved by grace alone. And that cost is we give up all fallacious and false and spurious claims to self-righteousness, to self-sufficiency. We lose any leg to stand on as we are dropped to our knees in humility and thanksgiving before a righteous God. We know that we are made to be blessedly, absolutely dependent upon Him. And the lawyer, who was trying to earn his salvation, save his own eternal soul, quoted the law back to Jesus. He said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus replied to the lawyer, "You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live." Now, there is something in the law that is called burden of proof. It's called burden of proof. And the lawyer must have understood that his good and righteous deeds for his fellow man could not rise to the level of proof that he loved his neighbor as himself. And so he himself was burdened by this obligation. He was burdened because of the way he saw the law. You see, he saw the law not as a tool to know God and to experience His grace, but as a way to bind God into giving Him what He wanted. And in his burdened soul, he knew that he was not good enough. And so he began to do what we always do when we know we're not good enough, when we know we don't rise to the level of expectations. He began to parse words and equivocate, and he began to hedge. And when you live by the law, when you don't live by grace, but when you live by the law, you will always try to manipulate the law to your own advantage. And the simplest way to manipulate the law, to work the law to your own advantage, is to make it conform to you rather than you conform to it. In other words, you become the standard by which the law is judged rather than the law being the standard by which we are judged. John Calvin compared the law to a mirror into which we gaze to see what we really look like. And when it came to the question of, do I love my neighbor as myself, the lawyer tried to break the mirror because he did not like what he saw in it. And the lawyer, we are told, wanted to justify himself. And so when he was speaking to Jesus, he stroked his beard and he knowingly clucked his tongue and he raised his finger in the air and he asked Jesus another question. Luke 10:29. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus answered with a question of his own. One of the most famous parables the world has ever known. He said a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and we saw him. He passed to the other side, and so likewise a Levite, when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and he saw him, and he had compassion, and he went, and he bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then he set on him his own animal, and brought him to an inn, and take care of him. Now we have to ask at the outset, what point is Jesus trying to make about our neighbor and the people with whom we are called to be neighbors here? So we must remember that Jesus was responding to this man's question designed to manipulate the law so he could just be justified in doing exactly whatever he wanted to do. He wanted to make the law square with how he lived rather than square his life with the law. In short, the lawyer didn't want to be a neighbor with just anybody. He wanted to limit his exposure to love. He wanted to limit his need to risk and to be uncomfortable, to have upheaval and have sacrifice, that comes along with being a neighbor to somebody. So everyone we meet to us is either a neighbor or they're a nobody. They're either a neighbor or they're a nobody. And we are faced with a choice. We can treat them like a neighbor, someone whose life matters, or as a nobody, someone whose life matters very little. Jesus places in our path, specifically for the purpose of being treated by a neighbor, those who need to receive the gospel, those who need to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. And so how can we recognize that? How can we recognize someone Jesus intends to be our neighbor? First thing is a neighbor is someone who knows need. A neighbor is someone who knows need. Now, Jesus' parable begins with a man walking down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And this road would have been well known to the lawyer. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was about 18 miles long, and it was steep. It descended about 3,300 feet. And it was full of twists and full of turns and rocks and boulders, and it was isolated. And it was an infamous place for highwaymen to rob travelers. And so anyone traveling it, especially traveling alone, was limited in their options, and they were traveling for a desperate purpose, hoping that their worst fears would not be realized traveling that road. But in this case, this man's worst fears came true. A group of men stripped him and beat him and robbed him, and they left him for dead. And so the immediate issue here, the crisis for which created a neighbor, someone worthy of being loved in the same way we love ourselves, was this deep and urgent need. When we meet people who have needs, we're faced with a pair of responses. We can meet them at their point of need, or we can point ourselves in a different direction. We can help them, or we can hurry away. This is our choice. This is our free will. But what Jesus' parable makes plain is that the condition of a neighbor is caused by some unmet need. And the natural reaction, most people, when they come across someone who has a need, is to do what? What is our natural reaction? Our natural reaction is usually to step back and recoil and look away and ignore the need. And this was certainly the reaction of the priest and the Levite who saw the Samaritan laying there and who Jesus subtly pointed out crossed over to the other side of the road. Now, this gives rise to a joke, and we sort of need a joke at this point in the sermon, don't we? This gives rise to a joke. Why did the priest and the Levite cross the road? That's okay, that's good. That's one answer, to get to the other side. No, why did the priest and Levite cross the road? The answer is they were chicken. They were afraid to get their hands dirty. They were afraid, I wrote that, by the way, in case you can't tell. Afraid they might get involved in something more than they can handle. Afraid of an injured man lying by the side of the road. The God who provides all of our needs will give you what you need to meet someone else's need. Frederick Buechner famously said, "The place where God calls you is a place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need." The place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. This is the definition of call. And when God calls us, he promises he will be with us, and he commands, don't be afraid. So where's the Holy Spirit calling you to make a neighbor rather than a nobody? What does the person whom God has placed in your path need? Do they need someone to just listen? Do they need a ride somewhere? Do they need a meal? Do they need a friend? Do they need hope? Maybe they just need someone to recognize them as a neighbor rather than a nobody. Second thing we see about a neighbor here is a neighbor is someone who is beyond a boundary. A neighbor is someone who is beyond a boundary. Now, every good story has a twist in it. It has something unexpected. It has some detail that shatters your expectations, and it is in this breaking, it is in this shattering, it is in this twist that gives the parable its meaning and its power. And this shattering, this twisting, this breaking often involves breaking boundaries, people stepping out of expected roles, and this is the case here. Now, if you were injured or you were hurt, you would expect a religious figure like a priest or a Levite, someone who's supposed to love God with all their heart, mind, and strength, and love their neighbor themselves. You would expect them to do something about it. Years ago, I was on a bike ride. near a lake, and I was in the middle of this huge state park, and it was late on a Monday morning, and I was rounding a corner on a trail, and a very large man on a bike was on my side of the trail, and he didn't see me. He was enjoying the morning, enjoying looking at the view of the lake, and we collided with each other head on. And I went flying over him, landing several feet away, and I was injured, and I was really badly hurt, and I was bleeding everywhere, and I was in terrible pain as I flew like 7 or 8 feet through the air and just landed flat on my back on this asphalt trail. And the man who hit me, who was riding his bike, took off running into the trees. And I laid there at least 2 hours from home, barely able to move, and I had nothing left in me but to pray a very simple prayer. And the prayer was, Jesus, can you help me? Jesus, can you help me? And I kid you not, within less than a minute, 2 nuns walked out of the forest. Totally true. Totally true story. 2 nuns walked out of the forest. Now, what if I told you that those 2 nuns who saw me lying there pretended not to see me, and they crossed over to the other side of the trail, and they just kept walking? What if I told you that? And then I followed up by saying a member of ISIS, a radical Islamist, also came along, and he stopped and bent down to help me. Now, that's not what happened, but, except for the nuns, that part is true. They really did come out of the forest. We'll get to in a minute. But that's the kind of boundary breaking we're talking about in Jesus' parable here. A Levite, a member of the priestly tribe who helped take care of all the holy things, who attended to all the religious duties in the temple, he saw the man, stripped and beaten, lying half dead, just kept walking, walked to the other side of the road. Then a priest, a holy man, he did the same thing. Then a Samaritan came along. This would have been the last person anyone hearing Jesus' parable would have expected. Samaritans, they were a mixed-race people, and they combined traditional Jewish religion with paganism, and for that reason, they were despised by the Jews. A Jewish person, rather than walking through Samaria, would walk dozens of miles around the region to not go through Samaria. It's like Norm Stewart driving through Kansas. He'd go down to go up to Nebraska and then over and then back down again. So Jesus could not have picked a more unlikely candidate to help out a Jewish man who had been left for dead. And this would have been a shockingly unlikely and incredible boundary breaker. Now, we said last week that Jesus has made himself our neighbor by moving into our neighborhood. God's only Son, the King of heaven, made himself a peasant, a servant in a sinful and a broken world. He's the ultimate boundary breaker. God waded through an absolute sewer of sin, an unimaginable boundary to get to you and me. And Jesus calls us to do the same thing. We live in a culture now that is increasingly stratified, seemingly ever more divided. We live in what are called tribes now. There are more and more boundaries and barriers. We can't disagree agreeably. We are divided into liberals and conservatives, and rich and poor, and makers and takers, and blacks and whites, and reds and blues, etc., etc. There's a lot of people who fear we're so divided across so many lines that we cannot possibly hold together. But if we look at this through the eyes of Jesus, with the lens of a good Samaritan, we will see opportunities to reach across boundaries more than ever before. All these boundaries you see and we struggle with, they're not God-made. They're not God-made. They're human manufactured, and they are made to be broken. Jesus broke the boundary between heaven and earth. He stretched his nail-scarred hand right across it and grabbed us by the scruff of the neck to yank us up to heaven. And he calls us to do the same thing and make a neighbor rather than a nobody by reaching across boundaries. Now, you may have seen the story in the news last week about 4 policemen in Homestead, Pennsylvania. That's a Pittsburgh suburb, and they were sitting there eating in a restaurant, and a couple came in, and they were appointed by the waitress to sit down in the booth next to the officers. And the couple told the waitress they don't want to sit next to a policeman. So the policeman overheard the whole thing, and he even said to the couple, "We won't hurt you." And the man just sort of glared at the officers and asked for another table. There's a definite boundary there. And this all happened the morning after 5 policemen were shot in Dallas during a protest. and 2 black men were killed by police in Minneapolis and Baton Rouge. What did the Pennsylvania policemen do with the boundary laid out before them? Well, they broke it. They broke it. They bought the couple's meal, and they left a $10 tip on an $18 bill. To make a neighbor rather than a nobody, what boundaries is Jesus calling you to break? We make a powerful statement when we reach across sinful, man-made boundaries. We are instruments for the freedom of the gospel when we break down the walls that sinful humanity has put up. And then finally, before we end, if we come across someone whom God intends to be a neighbor, how do we do it? How do we do it? How do we treat the stranger like a neighbor rather than a nobody? And the Good Samaritan, the parable, I think strongly suggests one rule. One rule. A neighbor knows grace through knowing us. A neighbor knows Jesus' grace through knowing us. Now, the Samaritan, we're told, had compassion on the man. He had compassion on the man. He poured oil on his wounds. He poured wine on his wounds. He bandaged him. He put the man on his own animal. He carried him to an inn where he could rest and heal. And at the end, he helped take care of him. He derailed his trip, his plans, and his life to do something for the stranger that he had never met. To the Samaritan, there was nothing more important than helping the stranger, making him feel like a neighbor rather than a nobody. You know, the Samaritan could have easily helped this beaten man to his feet, given him some bandages, making sure he was okay, and just left him. This would have been expedient. This would have been efficient. This would have been to do what human decency requires. It would have checked the box. Jesus wants to make the point that the Samaritan went beyond what was required. Not only did he care for the man's immediate physical needs, but he shared a part of his soul as well. The Samaritan went above and beyond. How do we know grace when we encounter it? How do we know grace when we encounter it? Grace happens when we hold nothing back, when we're generous with our heart and our time, and our talent, and our treasure. Jesus held nothing back to make us neighbors rather than nobodies. And Romans promises that the God who gave his only Son will give us all things along with him to fulfill every need that we have. Grace holds nothing back. So I was laying there next to this bike path, beaten and broken and wounded by myself, praying in desperation, Jesus, please help me. And the nuns did come to my rescue. These 2 nuns came to my rescue after my bike wreck. They picked me up off the ground. They helped me over to a shaded picnic shelter. They got a first aid kit from the trunk of their car. They proceeded to clean and treat my wounds as I laid on the table. They had cold water for me that they had brought with their lunch. They offered me food. And for about 45 minutes, I just stayed with them as they made sure I was okay to help me get back to my truck so I could carry myself home. We talked about their lives and mine. Turns out there's a convent about 4 miles from that bike trail. They were enjoying a nice lunch together out in the open. We talked about Jesus, and before we left, they even prayed for me. Not only did they take care of me, but they shared who they were, and it was grace. It was Jesus' infallible, extraordinary grace poured out through fallible, ordinary people. And when I remember that sort of day, I am thankful for those 2 ladies who helped my body. But what I remember the most and cherish the most was what happened to my soul. Because my bike was broken, my body was bruised, I had been left injured along the side of the road, but my soul was filled with joy. That's grace. That's grace. And that's how the Samaritan did it. He shared himself, not just what he had. You see, the church is not in the business of doing nice things for people. That's not our business. We don't exist to do good deeds for others. We're not a bunch of do-gooders in the church. We're Christ followers. And if what we do is a mere transaction of goods and services, of meeting physical needs alone, we've failed. We have utterly failed. We exist to point to Jesus Christ. We're called to transcend heaven and earth and direct people to Jesus. And if we're going to point to Jesus, we can't do it with our finger. We can't do it with our hands. We must use our whole life, and that's costly. That's costly. Grace costs us nothing. Doesn't mean it's not expensive. But we will see next week that whatever it costs, Jesus will pay us back. He will supply every need to make sure we make neighbors rather than nobodies. Sheldon, would you pray with us, please?